Okay. So firstly, I'd just like to welcome everybody and thank you for joining us this evening. We're going to be looking at the 2023-24 grant funding available from the City Council and the application process. And this year there's something new for some of you to hear about, which is slightly different from previous years. So we've now got actually 2 application processes. So try and stay awake for that bit if any of you are interested in smaller grants from the council. So I've met some of you before, but for those who don't know me, I'm Julie Cornwall. I'm the Community Funding and Voluntary Sector Manager at Cambridge City Council, and I manage the grants team and the grant funds that we're talking about today. But most of the hard work is undertaken by the grants team, and our Senior Grants Officer, Melanie Baker, is joining us today. Most of you, I'm sure, will know Melanie. She's been with us a long time, and Melanie will also be talking to some of the slides. And also, I'm pleased to say that joining us today is a new member of our team. She started with us only 3 weeks ago, and that's Deb Curtis, and she is the new grants officer. So I'm sure she'll be in touch with some of you to introduce herself. And we're going to try to allocate some of the groups that we work with to specific officers, so we can really work on building up those relationships with you, and you've got kind of a quick and easy access to the grants team. So some of you may well get to know Deb really well over the next few months. And also today we have Mark Freeman with us, who's the CEO of the Cambridge Council for Voluntary Services, who I'm sure you all know really well. And thank you to Mark and CCVS for hosting the webinar today. And Mark has the short straw of finalising the webinar by telling you all about what CCVS does and what support they can offer, and that's later on. So thank you, Mark, for hosting again for us. So what the plan is, unless any of you feel strongly that you want to participate throughout, is that everyone will be muted, and that ideally we'd like general questions in the chat, and then we'll get through them at the end. But if you've got something really burning that you just have to say or have to put in, when I'm sure one of us can pick it up as we go along. So I think that's all the kind of introduction. Mark, could I ask you to share the screen and start your slideshow, or is it started and I can't see it? No, that's it. Thank you. So as I'm sure a lot of you know, we've held application workshops for many years. Pre-COVID, I think they were actually in person, and the feedback that the team's had over the years is that they've been helpful, because we can clarify what funds are available, what our application process is, and any requirements around that funding stream. If you can move on, thanks, Mark. So there is a grants gateway which the council uses to process the 3 major funds that are available to community groups to apply for. And this was implemented in 2019, and that pulls together the funds that you can see there on the screen. And the aim really is to ensure that there's a clear and consistent approach for everybody, there's greater transparency, and that it's an efficient process. And the main funds available are community grants, which is really what the focus of this evening's session will be on, homelessness prevention and sustainable city grants. But as you will see, coming off the community grants little circle, community grants are kind of a bit bigger because we have area committee grants as well, and we also deal with discretionary rate relief too. And this time, when I talked to you or mentioned earlier about there's something new for this year, we're actually piloting an approach for smaller grant applications, so grant applications under £2,000. And we wanted to try and make the process a bit simpler. So we will be talking about that later. So all of the grants linked to City Council priorities, and they're all outcomes focused. We really want to know about the difference that's made as a result of the activity. It's not so much the activity in itself. We're really looking for the benefits for people who participate and the positive changes that will happen as a result of us giving grant funding to a particular activity. Next slide. Thank you, Mark. So this slide sort of covers really what we would hope to see in a bit more detail. So the Community Grant Fund has around £1 million available. And usually £70,000 of this is allocated to the area committee grants, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly. So as I've already said, this year we've got a different process for applications of £2,000 or under. So to apply for a main grant with a value of over £2,000, activities must be one of the priority activities which are listed there. So that's must be related to active lifestyles or improving active lifestyles. It could be an arts and cultural activity, could be a community development activity, could be an activity that's aimed at reducing poverty for the participants. It could be a service providing legal and or financial advice. It could be a project or activity around employment support. And we also fund activities which build the capacity of the voluntary sector to support activities that other groups might be running too. So as well as falling into one of those priority activities, the activity must also demonstrate that they meet the primary outcome. Ultimately, what we expect is any project that we fund and any activity that we fund must reduce social and or economic inequality for city residents with the most need. Unfortunately, in the climate that we're all living in now, we are not interested in funding activities for people that can afford to pay. So what we're really looking for is for evidence from groups that their project and their activity is really targeting the people that need support most, and that we're going to see some improvements around their social and economic situation. And we'd expect to achieve, or the activity to achieve, one or more of the strategic outcomes that you can see there. So we'd expect the activity to reduce poverty, improve skills and confidence to gain employment, improve general health and well-being. It could be an activity that brings communities together and helps bring about a positive change in that community. And also, ultimately, we want a stronger voluntary sector in the city. So there is an application guide which details and gives examples of the sorts of activities that we would fund, and also the kinds of activities that wouldn't be eligible. So I really recommend that you read that document. And also, actually, you can look at previous committee reports, and I can share those if any of you are interested, where you can see the kind of activities that have been approved for funding. Next slide, please. Okay, so with the small grants fund, as you can see, the primary outcome is still the same. What we're still wanting to do is to support activities that reduce social or economic inequality for city residents with the most need. But we're expecting to do this through funding applications which focus on bringing people together to improve the quality of life for residents experiencing the greatest social or economic deprivation. So you'll see there are some of the kind of priority areas missing that are in the main grants. And we're not expecting necessarily, for example, a money advice service to be delivered for less than £2,000. What this is really about is we want to help people to be more active in their communities, widen access to arts and culture, bring communities together, reduce poverty and reduce social isolation and loneliness. So you just see that it's they're sort of simpler set of priorities, really. Next slide. So this is a pilot. We're trialling the small grants process this year, and it's actually an electronic form only. So it's an online application process. We hope it will be much more straightforward. Mark has shared the pain of us trying to develop this, as have some of our other critical friends in the Cambridge Ethnic Community Forum, because we really wanted to develop a much simpler form that kind of recognised that actually in the past, if you wanted to apply for £800 for a trip, for example, you were still having to complete the same form as a group that was applying for £80,000. So we really wanted to identify, you know, the absolute essential questions and information that we need as a local authority to be able to be confident that we can make an award, and kind of strip back some of the things that really weren't that necessary. So there are less questions in the application form, and the level of detail that we expect applicants to provide is less. But what I would say, though, is that all applications must demonstrate that there's a need for the project, and they must clearly set out what the anticipated impact of the activity will be and how this will be measured to prove the benefits to the participants. And some of you might be thinking, well, this sounds a little bit similar to the area committee grants. And I suppose they are, in that that's also a shorter form. But what I'd stress with these small grants is that these activities should be open to participants from across the city. So we're not looking at specific geographical areas, although we could be looking at particular communities in the sense that it could be, for example, an activity for older people, but we'd expect that activity to be available to any older person living in Cambridge City. So that's really the difference between the area committee and the small grants. And as I've said, this is an online only application. Next slide, please, Mark. Thanks. Oh, and I should have said, actually, that if you're worried and you've never tried to complete an online application form before, we can help with that at the grants team, and also CCVS can help with that. I mean, we won't be telling you what to put in it in terms of the actual content, but we can certainly help you navigate through the form. And we can do that on the phone, or we can, you know, sit with you on a Zoom call or a Teams call or something and talk you through it. So don't worry about it. It's lots of tick boxes. You can come back to a particular page. You don't have to complete it all before you move on to the next page. So there's lots of opportunities to revisit it. So if you're thinking about it, but you're a bit nervous, I'd really urge you to have a look. So discretionary rate relief is something that we also consider. We have an application form for that, which you can download from our website, or we can send to you. And for you to be considered for discretionary rate relief, so that's the part of your business rates which you perhaps don't already get, which you won't already get relief for, but you must complete the discretionary rate relief form in full, and you must demonstrate that the activities are running at your city premises must meet our funding priorities and outcomes. And you must demonstrate how awarding discretionary rate relief will reduce social and/or economic inequality by removing barriers for city residents with the most need. And the discretionary rate relief awarded will be proportionate to the number of beneficiaries that are city residents. This sometimes is relevant if, for example, you perhaps sublet part of your building to an organisation that perhaps has a national remit. We may not then be able to fund the full award for discretionary rate relief, but would certainly consider funding a proportion if a proportion of your activities were for city residents. So again, if you've got any questions about that, that's something that we can talk to you about after the meeting, or we could try and clarify later this evening. So I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to hand over to Melanie, and that was ready for the next slide. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Okay, so Julie's briefly mentioned area committee grants. So I'm just going to explain a bit more about the difference between the round that's open at the moment, which we sometimes call the main round, and area committee grants, which will be opening later in December. So the outcomes and priority areas are the same for both the round that's currently open and area committee grants, but there are some key differences. Julie's touched on the fact that the current round is for citywide activities. And so these are for activities where residents live all over the city. And so if you're wanting to apply for a citywide project, you need to apply now. If you're applying using the over £2,000 application request form, then there's no upper limit to how much you can apply for. But we would say, please bear in mind that the budget will be very pressured. We do have a habit of saying this every year, admittedly. But obviously this year, with the cost of living crisis, it is something that I think it's going to be even tougher this year, making the budget stretch. If you're a group that's new to us as well, we would probably be looking to make a more modest contribution towards your activity until we got to know your organisation better and how your activity works and how it links into what else is happening locally. So if your project is just for beneficiaries living in a particular part of the city, then you need to apply for an area committee grant. Cambridge City is split into 4 areas, and you apply to the area where the residents live that will participate in the activity. So you can see on the blue part of the slide, we've got the north area covering Arbury, East Chesterton, Kings Hedges and West Chesterton, and then there's the south, east and west central areas, and it lists the wards that those areas cover. So these are very much smaller neighbourhood projects. And it's a simpler application form which reflects the amount of funding available. So groups can apply for up to £5,000 for each area. You can apply for more than one activity, but the maximum request for all the activities put together shouldn't be more than £5,000. As we said, area committees will be launched in December. We're just in the process of arranging the dates for when you would apply to each area committee. They follow their area committee meeting cycle. So we'll be working back from the committee dates, which usually, the committee meetings usually take place in March. And we usually find that the deadlines then fall around sort of January, February, and there's a different deadline for each meeting because each area has its own committee meeting. Sometimes groups might apply to the main round, the citywide round, and we might, when we read their application, we might feel that actually they're a better fit for area committees because they're not actually a citywide activity, and we will sometimes in those cases refer them to the area committee grants. So next slide, please. So moving on to the homelessness prevention grants, this is a fund of approximately £300,000. It's a mix of grants and pre-allocated funding. You can see the primary outcome is to reduce the levels of homelessness and rough sleeping in Cambridge, and applications will also need to demonstrate that they meet one or both of the strategic objectives outcomes, which is to prevent or relieve homelessness and rough sleeping in Cambridge. They also need to demonstrate a clear understanding of rough sleeping and homelessness and have quantifiable solutions, and we'll be looking for information and evidence to support that. If you'd like to know more about this fund, then we have a specific application guide for it, so you can request that. And you can also make contact with James McWilliams, who is the Housing Services Manager, and he'll be able to give you further information about this fund. And his contact details are available later on in the presentation, at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. So the final fund that we manage through the Gateway is the Sustainable City Grants. This is a much smaller fund. There is £30,000 available in this fund, and organisations can apply for up to £10,000. And this can be for more than one activity, but the combined activities, the worth of the request for the combined activities should be no more than £10,000. You can see the aims of the fund there in the green box, and they're mirrored in the outcomes. And we would consider funding activities that meet those outcomes. Applicants will need to demonstrate quantifiable results. So for instance, direct measurable carbon savings, numbers of people targeted, numbers of activities delivered, for instance. And Janet Fogg, who I think has got the best name ever for the climate change officer, has asked me to make clear that the fund can't fund, unfortunately, capital costs, which are things like fixed and one-time expenses for assets, such as buildings and their fixtures, vehicles or equipment. And it also unfortunately can't fund research and feasibility studies. So I think we've had a few sort of requests or interest in funding those types of activities. So again, there's an specific application guide for this, and do get in touch with Janet if you'd like to find out more. Her details are also at the end of the presentation. So next slide, and back to Julie.
Okay, thanks. So this really just talks about how we decide if an organisation's eligible to apply and what you need to consider before applying for a grant. So I would say read the application guides really carefully before applying to ensure your activity, outcomes and organisation meet our eligibility criteria. We really don't want you to waste your time, and we won't be able to fund everything. So make sure that you do meet the criteria. There are also help notes available as well for you to download, and we really are happy to talk to anybody or respond to emails. So if you're not sure, then speak to somebody. So in terms of the activity, be really clear on what you're asking us to fund. The application form asks what specific activity do you want funding for. So we really suggest be concise. Sometimes we can read through applications and we've read 2 sides of A4 and we've still not really got much of an idea about what we're being asked to fund. You don't have to sell your whole organisation and every facet of what you do as an organisation. We can read that and we can research that if we need to. And actually, a lot of the time we know that already through our existing relationships with you. That bit where it says what specific activity do you want funding for, it really does need to be concise. And we want to know things like how many sessions, what are the sessions for, what's the frequency, where would they be? So you could be talking about drop-ins, coffee mornings, drama groups, workshops, that kind of level of information. We'd want to know the kinds of people that might attend that you're anticipating would be beneficiaries, and we'd want to know how you have or how you would consult with or involve your beneficiaries in planning the activity. Are there any other partners involved in helping you deliver the activity? And how are you going to ensure that it's a really high quality activity that you're going to deliver? And there's also a question there around how you're going to promote and publicise your activity. And we're really asking these questions to make sure that the thought's gone in at this point to how you are going to make this a success. And in terms of the beneficiaries, we do need to know who the activity is for, and it needs to, it could benefit the whole, a wide age range, or it could be a targeted group, but we need to know that you're clear as to who your beneficiaries are. And we need, obviously, we can only fund and provide funding for Cambridge City residents. That doesn't mean that other people can't participate. Perhaps they may live in South Cambs, they could just perhaps be outside the border, but we'll only fund the proportion of your activity that is for city residents. And we need to know how many beneficiaries are you expecting. Of course, it won't be precise, but we need to have a rough idea, because that helps us work out value for money. And we need to know there's a difference between total number of beneficiaries and what you expect the average attendance to be if you're delivering sessions for something. So we're interested in that, because of course you could have 5 people going to every single session, but it's still only 5 people. So we do need to understand that, really. And we need to know how you'll know it, and how are you going to monitor your actual number of beneficiaries that participate. I've already mentioned that this is an outcomes focused fund. So this is the bit that we're really, really interested in, which is around why is the activity needed and what evidence do you have to support that there is that need? How will your activity meet our primary and strategic outcomes? And then how are you going to be able to evidence that your activity has met the outcomes that you tell us? So we've slightly changed, and you'll see if you're successful in getting an award, and we've slightly changed the phrasing on our monitoring forms, because what we found is that in the application form we ask you to describe how you're going to measure success effectively, And then in the monitoring report, what we'd really like to see is what those successes are, what your survey, for example, has told you, some statistics, but sometimes we haven't been getting that information. We've just had something like our participants told us it was a brilliant day out. But what we really need is to see the actual evidence of that, or to hear about it. So, you know, what is the actual outcome of your survey? So we've kind of tried to rephrase the question because perhaps we weren't clear enough really, but we want you to think about that level of detail at the start, so that when it comes to reporting back to us, you've already had the mechanism set up and established, so that that monitoring information is to hand really. And in terms of the organisation, just briefly describe what the organisation does, and then look at the organisation eligibility checklist. Make sure that the structure is appropriate, make sure that all the governance and finances are in place, and that you're able to send us the information that we need. Okay, next.
Julie, is it just worth saying as well that for the small grants, obviously we're not expecting the same level of detail as we are for the over
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think also particularly I should say that for small grants, where if you don't have a bank account and if you haven't quite got your governance in place, but if your project really does look like it meets the criteria in terms of, you know, could this really make a difference for people that need support most, we would really encourage you to apply. And I was just in a meeting with Mark earlier today where he said quite rightly, we can sort out the rest afterwards. So even if you don't think you can dot all the I's and cross all the T's, please still really think about applying, because we can support you to get everything else in place. But I would say we obviously won't be able to give you the money until all of that stuff's in place, but that shouldn't prevent you from applying. Okay, next slide. I'm afraid there are rather a lot of application forms, depending on what it is that you might be interested in applying to us for. And we've talked about quite a few of them already, well, all of them in fact. So we have the main community grants application form, which you can download from our website or can be sent to you. In fact, you've all probably got it. I'm sure Jane's already sent it to you. That is for applications for grants of over £2,000. Sometimes groups apply for more than one activity, and that's when you would use the community grants additional activity form. And also you may be applying for an activity, but you also may be applying for discretionary rate relief. That's absolutely fine. And I think I've just seen a question pop in asking, could you apply for, I'm thinking the question's disappeared under your computer is about to restart alert, so I can't now see it, but I think it was saying, could you apply for more than one? So yes, you could apply for a sustainable city grant for one project or activity, and you could also apply for a community grant activity, just as long as you meet those criteria and that you're, you know, evidencing the need and so on. That's fine.
Oh, go on, sorry.
Well, what I was going to just say is the only exception really to this is that you can't apply for a small grant and the main community grant. You can apply for up to 2 small grants with a total of £2,000, because we really don't want, well, we really want to encourage smaller and potentially even new groups to our grant funding to apply for the small grants, rather than perhaps some of the bigger groups carving up bigger projects and trying to kind of make it fit. Really, that small grants application form is just as it says on the tin, really. And what we'd like to do at some point, hopefully in the future, but not this time, is maybe even have that open all year round. But that's something for the future, and we'll see how it goes. Melanie, you were going to add something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that you can't apply to more, for the same activity. You can't apply to multiple funds for the same activity.
But you can,
go on, sorry.
No, I was to say, you can be assured though that we'll read all of them, whichever one that you apply for. And if we think, for example, I had this query earlier from a group, they weren't sure where they've got a food project, They weren't sure whether to apply for a sustainable city grant or a community grant. So I've had that conversation with a colleague, and on balance, we think to apply for a community grant. But if when we read the application, we think actually this is a better fit for a sustainable city grant, then that's something that we'll have those discussions internally, and we'll kind of, we want to give out the grant funding. We're not there to kind of block that. We'll be more about enabling that application to be successful, really. So yeah. Did you want to add anything else, Melanie? Or Mark, do you want to add anything at this point? He's gone to sleep.
It's Bake Off. The second half of Bake Off has obviously started.
Okay.
I'm fine at the moment, and I'm trying to juggle all my screens. So
okay.
that and talking at this time of night, it's too difficult.
I know, I'm sorry. Okay, well, just chip in if you do think of anything else. So, and just a reminder that for the small grants applications, you need to complete the electronic online form for each of your applications. So if you did want to apply for two, we'll need two separate applications, just as we would for if you were applying for more than one of the main grants. But hopefully you'll find it much quicker than the usual form. And I would say make sure you have the right form for your project. I mean, I have said that we'll make sure that you do, but I really hate one of you to complete a homelessness prevention grant application form, for example, for something that's completely not related to homelessness. So are there grants available to support sporting activity? Yes, active lifestyles type activities are one of our priority areas. But what I would say is you need to still make sure it links into reducing social or economic deprivation. So yes, but really make sure that you can evidence the need and evidence what the improvements will be for those beneficiaries. Next slide, I think. Thank you. And this could be you, Melanie.
Mm-hmm. Yep, so we have covered quite a bit of this already, but before you sit down to start filling out your application, do make sure, first of all, that your organisation is eligible. Check the application guide for the fund, and also on the application forms, there's also some eligibility criteria, organisation eligibility criteria. So I suggest you check through those as well first. Obviously, make sure your activity meets our grant outcomes and priorities. Make sure you know what you need to put for each question. For the community grants over £2,000 application form, there are some specific help notes which go through question by question. With the other forms, there's sort of the information is kind of embedded in the form. And yeah, so that make sure you read the help notes if you're doing the community grants one. Make sure you send in all of the required documents. The next slide covers that. And also make sure you have looked at how we process your data. We've got a privacy notice that is included in the application guidance. So we can only assess your application based on what you put in your form, and we need information about the group, your activities, and how you intend to deliver and monitor. We need that information in order to be able to do the assessment. So we can only make awards based on the information you provide, so please make sure you give us as much information as you can. Although when we've got lots and lots of application forms to read through, we do appreciate things sort of being concise, and bullet points are really appreciated. Make sure that if you are successful in getting an award, that you spend it on the purpose detailed in your grant agreement. Sometimes we appreciate when you apply to us, you might have an idea of how you're going to run your activity and you receive your award, but then when you come to run it, things change. Thinking of COVID being one excellent example, but obviously other things can happen too, and you may not be able to run it quite as you planned. I know, please do get in touch with us first if you want to make any changes to how you're going to deliver it, because when we receive your monitoring form, we'll be expecting to see it being delivered as per the purpose on your grant agreement. And unfortunately, if it says if you've done something differently, then ultimately we could ask for that money to be repaid, and that's something we don't like to do, but unfortunately we will do if we feel like it's not meeting the outcomes and delivering how we expected. Sometimes we might even specify in the grant agreement that there's particular things that we will fund, so make sure you do read your grant agreement and make sure that you take account of that. Next slide, please. So accompanying documents. So this is information that we need to help understand your organisation and your finances. So on the right hand side, you can see the sort of information we need. Obviously for the under £2,000, we don't need this level of information. We certainly would need a governing need the group to be constituted if we were going to send them a grant agreement, although you wouldn't need that at the point of applying. But the policies, we take a lighter touch, so we'd be looking for the key policies for those smaller awards. So perhaps the safeguarding policy if the activity involved children or vulnerable adults, a risk assessment. We'd probably want to see insurance if that was appropriate. But for the over £2,000 applications, and obviously for homelessness and sustainable city, we'd be looking for these core policies. If you're a new group and you've a newly formed group, you may not have all of these policies in place, and that's not necessarily a problem, but get in touch with us to speak to us first. And it may be that there are some policies that don't have ready at the point of applying. If we feel like your activity is something we want to fund, then we would still fund you, but we would perhaps put in a condition that we would need to see that policy, say a safeguarding policy. Or would we need to see that you'd taken out insurance before we actually paid the award? In terms of financial information that we ask to see, obviously we need to see evidence that our funding is needed, and we also want to see that you've got good financial management processes in place. So we do that by looking at your budgets. Again, this would be asking for a current year's budget and a next year budget. That would apply for a over £2,000 award, or the homeless and sustainable city. This wouldn't apply to the under 2,000, although we would want to see a budget for the activity you're applying for. But for the larger awards, we want to see a monitored budget ideally, and also a budget for the following year where we could see the cost of the activity included in that budget. Want to see your accounts to see how you manage your money. And also in terms of being able to demonstrate financial need, obviously reserves policy allows us to see if, your financial situation and whether there are any other resources that you could utilise. We want to make sure that we're funding those groups that can't fund it with their existing funds. So in addition to those finances, the finance section on the application form, I'll give a more general picture of the finances for the activity you're applying for. And we'll also use this as part of your monitoring if you're successful. So we'll compare the costs that you've put on your application form with the actual costs of delivering the activity. And we might ask to see copies of receipts. So please keep those in case we ask to see them. So we'd want to see the main costs of the activity and want to be able to see those in your whole organisational budget. Any sources of income that you have, whether that's secured or still to be approved. And as Julie said before, we will be looking at how much you're requesting from us as a percentage of the total costs. And we'll be comparing that to what percentage of your beneficiaries are from the city. So if you're requesting 70% of the costs from the city council, but only 50% of the beneficiaries are from the city, then unfortunately we wouldn't be able to fund you to 70%. The most we would be able to fund would be 50%. And we'll also be looking at the finance section, having a look at some of the costs that have been included, trying to see if the activity is good value for money. We see quite a lot of very high publicity or management or overhead costs. And we are happy to see costs for these items in the budget, but they need to be proportionate to the activity that's been applied for. Okay, thank you very much. Next slide, and it's Julie.
Okay, so as I'm sure you all know, the deadline for applications is 12 o'clock on Monday, the 3rd of October, D-Day. And then there's a process where the grant officers are looking at all of the applications and assessing those. Sometimes that's done with strategy officers that are sort of more expert in a particular area. So there are several people that look at each application, which is quite helpful. Sometimes we go back and ask groups things, but there are so many applications that, as I think it already said in a previous slide and Melanie stressed, we really can only assess based on what's in the application form. So, but if there's anything blindingly obvious and we've spotted it before our assessment meeting, we may come back to groups if we need any points of clarification. So officers between them try to pull together a set of recommendations. They go to whichever scrutiny committee is relevant, and those dates change. For next year, Housing Scrutiny Committee is on the 24th of January. Environment and Scrutiny Committee, which is where all of the community grants go, including discretionary rate relief, that committee meeting is on the 19th of January. And then an executive councillor decides the Sustainable City Awards. And then full council agrees its budget in February. And then at that point, we can let groups know that for sure, you know, what their funding award is. But all of our agendas and papers will be available for each of those committees at least a week before the committee. And I believe that Jane, I might be wrong, Melanie, you can tell me, does Jane email everybody just to let them know that the papers are published?
I think so, yeah, I think that's normally what happens, yeah.
So you may have a heads up as to what's being recommended if you were to look at those papers. So keep an eye out for that email, which will be about a week before the committee, whichever's relevant for your application. And yes, Andrea, we will be sending the slides out, so you don't have to worry about making a note of all these dates. Okay, Mark, next slide, please. Okay, so as I've said, council approves its full council budget in mid-February. So that's when we can formally confirm the awards, although we do tell you after committee, and you can see for yourselves on our website what whether the recommendations were approved or not. We will confirm after full council that those grant levels are as expected, and as a result of that we will send out the grant agreements in March next year. So that's when you'll be able to see, I think as Melanie's already said, if there are any specific conditions that we might put on a grant. For example, if you need a child protection or safeguarding policy and you haven't got one, we might specify that within a grant agreement. And the grant agreement just generally sets out what the expectations are from both parties. And then we will make payments as soon as we've had the grant agreement signed and returned to us and it's been countersigned. We will send that off to you, and then we'll start making the payments. Awards over £10,000 are made in instalments. Any less than that are made in one lump sum. So yeah, and I would say if there are any outstanding grant conditions, we can't make the payment until the grant conditions have been met. I think that's what I want to say on that. So next slide, please. So this is really a summary, and I would apologise for duplication, but I'm not going to, because every year we still have applications where it really isn't clear how the activity might fit the outcomes and priorities for the council. And that can be really sad, because we can see the amount of work that an organisation's put in. And it could be a brilliant activity or project, but it must meet our outcomes and priorities, or we just won't be able to fund it. And really, evidence the need for the project. I'm sure lots of you have already got some really powerful testimony really from beneficiaries if it's an activity you've already run before, and that could be supported with local and national data. And be really clear about what activity you want us to fund, and make sure that it's really well planned, and ideally if you can demonstrate that it's sustainable and that you might not need to come to us year after year, that's a bonus really. And we need to be clear that the activity is good value, that the budgets that you've presented are accurate and reasonable, and that you have thought about other potential sources of income as well. And we need to be confident that the organisation that's applying for the funding actually needs the funding. You know, if there's a huge amount of funding in reserves and that it's not explained, you know, we will be questioning that. You know, our funding really does need to go to the people that need it most. The organisation must meet our eligibility criteria, and needs to be sustainable and well managed. And we've said this before, but if you're a new group to us, we really would welcome an application. But you know, be realistic in terms of what you're applying for, because as with most things, you know, we need to build a relationship with you as a group, and when we're confident that you're able to manage a project through successfully completing one round of grant funding, it perhaps is the case that future grant rounds you could perhaps be a bit more ambitious with an application. Make sure you've got your monitoring systems in place so that you're able to provide us with the evidence that your activity was brilliant and really made a difference to those participants, and that you achieved the outputs and outcomes that you hoped, or if you didn't, that you understand why. Perhaps you've even overachieved, but you know, we need the evidence to show that, and that's really helpful for us. And I haven't really touched on this, but we will be carrying out a grants review imminently, some point in the next few months, and what we really need is some evidence to prove that the council's grant funding is really making a difference in communities, and it has a really high value for communities, and we really need your help there as potential successful applicants for the next grant round. What you tell us is what then we can tell elected members and senior officers, so it's really important that you give us the evidence to make sure that we continue to have a really effective grants fund. So make sure you've completed the form fully. It needs to be concise, coherent and correct. Make sure everything's signed and dated. We do need detailed information, but I should say detailed relevant information. And submit all of the requested documents. If you can't for some reason submit something, perhaps you're getting final sign off of an updated policy, that's fine, just let us know that in the email. Yeah, make sure everything's with us by the 3rd of October, particularly the application forms. We won't be considering applications beyond 12 noon on the 3rd of October. And what I would say is really important is make sure you've got no outstanding issues, such as outstanding monitoring from previous years, because that will have an impact on where we allocate funding. If we've got a really pressured budget, we're not going to be funding groups either at all or to the extent that they may wish that we did if we've you know, had problems in the past, or we've still got outstanding information that's required. It's really going to be a competitive process this year. So next slide, please. So yeah, complete the application form and send it back with all the accompanying documents. I should say actually that in previous years we've said if you've sent us your safeguarding policy before, don't worry about sending it again. Actually, this year what we're asking for is a whole set of everything, because normally most people can just click attach and attach the document. We want to have the most up-to-date policies, because what we're finding is we were having to go back to groups and check. And an ask, because perhaps the policy was dated 2012, for example. So it's really helpful if you could make sure that we have your most up-to-date policies and that they're dated as such. It may be that originally it was written in 2012, but we just need to know it's been reviewed recently. So, I mean, I guess it's good practice anyway, isn't it? Just to have that information on the front or the back of the document. Make sure you sign the declaration and just make a note of that deadline, because as I say, we won't be able to consider applications that haven't been received by the deadline. Next slide, please. I will be circulating the slides, so don't worry about trying to write all of this down. But you'll see we have strategy officers that have got expertise in particular areas of sort of council strategy and policy. So they're a really good port of call if you're thinking about an arts project, for example, or you want some advice around a sustainable city grant application. You can see the details, the name and the contact details for the people that are most likely to be able to help you. But you can always drop the grants team a line as well if you're not really sure who might best be able to help your query. And of course, CCVS are there as well to help with general queries around what makes a good grant application, for example, and how to write a policy from scratch. But I don't want to steal Mark's thunder, because I think that's the next slide, Mark. So over to you.
Right. Yes. Should be quick. We're here to provide advice and support with your applications. We won't write it for you. That has to be down to you. We are happy to act as a bit of a critical friend. So if you've got an idea, we will check that it makes sense for us. And if it makes sense for us, it's more likely to make sense for Julie and her team. But again, we can't tell you what will and won't get funded. That is very much down to the City Council. So we can point you in the direction of things that have been funded in the past, and we can help you with the different aspects of your budgets and your policies and all of those sorts of things. That's relatively easy. The hard bit for you is coming up with the story of what you're going to do and the difference that that's going to make, and why that is relevant to what the City Council are trying to achieve. So I'd echo a lot of the things that Julie and Melanie said. Read the guidelines and check that you are eligible for this funding. Take the opportunity to talk to the grants team before you start your application. They are there and they will have a conversation with you. So you should always do that if you get an opportunity. Once you've written your form, try and get someone who's nothing to do with your group to read it. If it doesn't make sense to them, it probably won't make sense to anyone else who reads that. So, find that person who's going to read it and say, I still have no idea what you're going to do. Because if they're saying that, there's a good chance that that's what the grants team will feel when they try to read it. And I guess the last thing is, make sure you've ticked all of the boxes. So if you need to put in a budget, if you need to put in a policy, make sure they're there. If you have done a budget, make sure your sums add up, because someone at the City Council will notice. So just make sure that you've spent time on the applications. But yeah, do contact us if you think we need any help. Obviously, there is also the ethnic community forums contact details there, and again, they can provide that sort of advice and support as well.
Yeah, Eddie's actually on the webinar as well. I don't know if he wants to say anything about support from CECF.
This is where we see if he's really here. Right?
Well, his contact details there are anyway, so
yeah. Okay, well, shall we stop sharing the screen and have a look at the questions? Could that be
do you want to stop the recording as well, or
let's keep the recording on just until we've answered the questions, just in case they're of interest to anybody else. So I think we answered the first question, I hope. Yes, you can apply for more than one kind of grant, but not for the same project. And yes, we could in theory fund a sporting activity. We don't fund anything that's competitive, I should say. And as I say, just really make sure there's a link between, between the sporting activity and reducing social and economic deprivation. And in terms of the, is there an electronic copy of the online form available? We can send you a copy to look at, but you can't complete it and post it to us. But if you just want a feel for what the questions are before you start, that's absolutely fine. We could just send you an email with that in, if that's helpful. Yes, thank you, Mark. Mark will, CCVS will help anybody with policies. And yes, we will circulate the slides and a copy of the recording to all attendees by the end of the week. Are there any more questions from anybody?
Yes, do you want me to write the question, or is it okay to ask?
You can just ask it, I think.
So if you have an activity, which is an art activity, let's say art lessons, and at the moment we're only offering it to people who can pay for it, and we would like to expand it to people who can't pay for it. It's children's art, so is that something, it would probably be possible to measure, but quite complicated? Is that within the scope of the grant, where the activity is in place, but you have to pay for it? So we would like to have some people who are not paying for it paid for.
Okay, do you want to answer that, Melanie? Or
well, I mean, ideally we would want you to be applying for, to pay for the people, to cover the costs of the people that can't afford to pay. Obviously the ones that can afford to pay, we don't want to fund those.
That's the idea.
Yeah, so we would be the people.
But it's okay if it's a mixed group and some are paying, some are not paying. You would fund that part.
Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes people like to, it's not a formal referral process, but for example, if you're working with another group who knew there was a particular family that would really benefit from attending, and they might perhaps contact you and say, there's a young person here or a family here. So we wouldn't expect you to just be necessarily openly advertising it, because how are you going to prove that those people can't afford to pay? So you need to just think about how you're going to target that.
Well, because we are Russian school, so the people we are looking to expand it to are the newly arrived Ukrainians, who would definitely be unable to pay at this time. By the time your grant comes, they might be able to pay. That's one of the troubles.
Yeah, and we are going to be actually launching a new grant scheme called United with Ukraine. So we haven't mentioned that here, but that's something that will be coming in the next 2 or 3 weeks. So look out for information about that. Any organisation that's working with people from Ukraine will be eligible to apply for some grant funding. But anyone that's interested in that, let us know and I can send you the information.
We're looking out for that, but because we think it will be more sustainable for us to have a stable grant for our arts activities, we're looking for that one. Okay, thank you.
Okay.
And Susie, just quickly, bear in mind that the City Council doesn't fund art activities for the sake of art activities. They fund art activities in order to meet their priorities, which absolutely yours will be, but that's got to be in the back of your mind as you write that. So the important bit almost isn't the art, it's the difference the taking part in the activity is going to have on the kids or the families or whatever. So it's about you know, reducing their isolation. It's about bringing them into the community and stuff.
Yeah,
So,
we've got a list of those aids, because we also
Cool.
have a teacher who is doing artist therapy, so kind of to put them at ease and all that and express
Cool.
themselves. So yeah, we've got all that on the list. We just can't wait for the applications to open, because we've got 20 people waiting to join the
I know, yeah. I'm so frustrated that I haven't been able to get you the United for Ukraine stuff sooner, Susie.
Yeah, yeah, and
I
you know,
can sense it, that you want to get on with it.
yeah, because see, we have very few people from South Camps because of the cost of travel. So we would have more, but because even if we applied for the grant to them for the £300, whatever,
Yeah.
then we have to separately apply for the travel costs for those people, and it's
not helpful, is it?
No. This is where you'd like it to be joined up, but
not for want of trying, but we won't get into that here. So we've got a question that sort of touches on something we've just said around what level of information do we need in terms of showing people can't pay. I mean, we're certainly not in the kind of realms of demanding that people evidence I don't know, that they're on benefits or something, but I think, you know, we'd expect you as an applicant to have an understanding of the areas of where there's the greatest need in the city, and that you're working perhaps with organisations that are already working with those groups.
Yeah, and I think anecdotal evidence, if you have a feel for that already from working with that group of people, that, you know, they're low income or whatever, if you can.
I'm just trying to think. I think we had a particular activity that was being delivered outside of the school curriculum, because I should just stress that we don't fund any activities that will be delivered as part of a curriculum, but you may well have a school that contacts a group that's delivering an activity, and may well say this person has free school meals, for example. You know, they may for some reason choose to disclose that. So we wouldn't want to see a list of participants with any kind of indication that you know, what benefits that family gets or anything, but it's more about we just need to know that this is not being advertised really widely to people that potentially could afford to pay. Don't know if you want to add anything, Melanie, to that.
No, I mean, it's the targeting, isn't it? So, but yeah, that covers it all, I think.
Okay, any other questions?
Colin, got a question.
Yeah, can
Thanks,
small grants, I've just got it written down here, maximum of 2 activities. Now, I'm representing Cherry Hinton Residents Association here. We're thinking of doing 2 activities under the community grants, but we'd also like to do one under the Sustainable Cities grants. Does that take us over the limit?
So with yours, Colin, is the activity, or are the activities that you're thinking about just for residents of Cherry Hinton, or are they open to everybody? Yes. So if they're just for the residents of Cherry Hinton, that would mean that you should apply for an area committee grant. So the decisions around that funding would still be all in place, ready for next financial year, but it means you don't have to apply now by the 3rd of October. It means for your ones that are community grants, you'd apply, it would be January, February time, wouldn't it, Melanie? And the window would open in December. For your activity, so then you could still apply for a Sustainable City grant, though, in theory. There's no reason why you couldn't, as long as you met that criteria.
I think probably speak to Janet Fogg about that. Yeah, get some further advice about.
Shall we get back to you, Colin? But in terms of the community grant, I think you would be looking at an area committee grant, not a small grant, if you're targeting Cherry Hinton.
Right. Yeah. And that's the same for the Sustainable City, or that?
Well, I think that's what we'd need to go back to. We'll check with Janet. I mean, I think she may not necessarily be so worried about geography. She may well just be interested in the, for example, carbon reduction, or
Yep.
the tons of waste that isn't going to go to landfill now, and she may not care, geographically speaking, where that's coming from.
Right.
And I suspect that will be the case. But if I just check with her, then I'll email you back, if that's all
Yeah,
right.
that'll be great. That'll be much appreciated.
No
And these
problem.
are for two different activities that you're talking about. You're not, just to double
Sorry?
check that as well. The two funds that you want to apply for, they're for different activities, aren't they? They're not for
Yes.
the same thing. Yeah. Okay, fine.
Yep.
Anybody else?
It might be an idea, Colin, if I don't know whether you want to perhaps send an email to the grants mailbox with just a few details about the project, the Sustainable City project, and then we could forward that, or you could email Janet directly. But if you wanted, you could email the grants mailbox, grants@cambridge.gov.uk, and we could forward that to Janet for you, just so she got a bit more information about the project. And if you include your phone number, I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions? I feel like we've flown through it. It probably felt like an eternity for you all listening. Can't see any other hands up. Can you, Mark?
That's it.
Okay, well, you know where we are. So if you think of anything after